Today is Friday, November 15th, 2024, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson. I'm here again with Mr. Wallace Smith, and yes, this is our second podcast today. We have a special guest.
We do. We weren't sure we'd be able to pull it together. We were going to feel really lame if the entire Council of Elders left and we did not get at least one wonderful man to sit down with us. But thankfully, we captured him. I was going to say captured him wandering the halls. That's an exaggeration. That didn't happen at all. We simply approached him, asked him if he would talk with us, and he graciously said yes. We have with us today Mr. Peter Nathan. Mr. Nathan, would you like to say hello?
Hello, everybody. Nice to be with you.
For the record, we normally have to ask people to get closer to the mic, but his voice rings out so well and solidly, we've had to ask him to back up. So clearly we've brought someone with it. In fact, I wish we had a Peter Nathan filter now. We could hit a button and then we all sit there sound like Peter. But anyway, we have Peter Nathan with us today. Thank you, Jake and Julia, again. And welcome again to Mr. Peter Nathan. It's for those who maybe didn't hear the previous podcast or didn't hear announcements and such. Plus, we will be putting this up probably a week afterwards. As we're recording this, we've just finished a week with the Council of Elders. I say a week. It's Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And I mentioned, when we did mention it in the last podcast, we have individuals from all over the world. Then I recognize, well, that sounds kind of dramatic. We have someone from Canada. We have Mr. Tyler there from Australasia. But there is an individual covering a good bit of that world, and he is with us now, Mr. Peter Nathan. Some of you may remember him from his podcast that he did with us actually some time ago.
Podcast number 29.
Thank Mr. Robinson, sharp on the references. Podcast number 29 to introduce you to Mr. Peter Nathan, an evangelist serving in the work and helping in Europe and in Africa, and then being here in Charlotte to help us out. So anyway, welcome, Mr. Nathan. It's wonderful to have you here talking with the teens and young adults.
Delight to be with you both.
Thank you very much.
And to speak to the young people.
Yeah.
My first question is...
Getting to it. Get right to it.
No, this is still warm up.
Okay, good. Okay, warm up.
At this point, I would guess you've lived more of your life outside of New Zealand than in New Zealand. What do you consider yourself these days? Are you a hybrid Ephraimite? Do you still hold true and steady to I'm a New Zealander?
No, I travel on a New Zealand passport in Africa in many places, but I use an American passport as well, so I'm a hybrid.
Okay.
That's better than mutant. Hybrid is a much better word.
So actually serving Africa, would there be benefit if you had a British passport?
Yes, but a New Zealand one is not a bad substitute. You have to play it.
Yes.
That really is part of the travel, right? If you have more than one passport, you do want to think about the country you're going to and which passport would be better to present.
Yes, exactly. Because, for instance, South Africa, if I use my New Zealand passport, I have to have a visa. If I use my American passport, I don't need a visa.
Wow.
That's interesting.
So automatically it becomes an economic issue.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it really does. Mr. Robinson and I, we don't get out much, so learning things like that are very helpful.
Well, I don't want to get too. I don't think we're quite ready to start talking a little more in depth about Kenya, since as many of you know, I was there for the feast this year. But getting on our plane, flying to London, racing across Heathrow to make our connection, and flying down, and I thought, Mr. Nathan's been doing this the last 50 years.
But you did have what was the other warm-up question we were talking about? We were curious. Our last podcast was about the election.
Yes.
And we would love a little perspective.
Yeah. So obviously, being Americans, we definitely fall in, even though we try to be aware of world news, we fall in the trap of kind of looking at things through an American filter. From the outside the U.S., and with as much as you travel, I would think you would get many opportunities to have some insight on this. What is the world? How closely do those outside the United States pay attention to the American elections, particularly the president? And do they have hopes one way or the other? I mean, do they hope one guy will get in, or is it just, let's see what happens?
Well, let me answer that with an example. The Labour Party, which just won the election in the United Kingdom, sent 100 people to help the Kamala Harris campaign.
Wow, actually did not know
that. And so the charge was made, is this not external meddling in
Foreign
the U.S.
interference.
election.
Yeah.
And, of course, it was downplayed. Well, we always do it. We always help. So, but it also helps you appreciate the view of Europe. Most of the European nations, with the exception of Hungary, for instance, and the current government of the Netherlands, would probably have been rooting for Camilla Harris. Now, the opposition parties, the Reform Party in the UK, are very much in the Trump camp. So, you get both sides being represented. And the leader of the Reform Party in the United Kingdom is very much a Trumpophile.
Nigel Farage comes over and helps him.
That's the man.
That's the man, okay.
Yes.
I forget, because he represented the UK in the European Parliament, but he doesn't do that anymore. And then he had his own, he championed Brexit, as I recall.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I remember him coming over and supporting the Trump campaign.
Yes. So he formed the UK Independence Party, which championed Brexit. And now it's transformed into called the Reform Party.
Okay.
I was going to ask about that. What do you think the prospects are for that party? It's not, it's been a while since y'all have had a real competitive third party, right?
Well, it was competitive in the UK campaign, but it denied the Conservatives probably 100 seats. So it took away from the Conservatives. But whether it lasts is another matter. When you just have one principal individual, how long does it last?
Right.
That's one of the reasons RFK Jr. dropped out of the race and heartily endorsed Trump, was he didn't want to split the vote.
Yes.
And that was pretty remarkable, frankly.
Yes.
And I did see because he already still was on the ballot in some states, I think, because I remember seeing one of the vote splits, and indeed he did have it wasn't enough to turn the difference, but he did actually still have a percentage in some of those.
I get the RFK Jr. YouTube channel is on my feed, and I watch the video of him saying, do not, even if I'm on the ballot, do not go vote for me in these states. If you want to do a vote for me, it's a vote for Trump.
Wow,
He's quite clear.
He was
about
very upfront. And so, what about more broadly? I can easily understand the UK being invested. One, knowing prophetically that they are brothers, that we're in the same family. There's a tie that even they don't understand, and many of us don't either. But then going broadly outside the nations of Israel, you're exposed to those in Africa as such. Of course, there's South Africa, which is also tied in there. But what is your sense they have when it comes to American elections?
Well, South Africa, for instance, has now become very heavily invested in the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So to a certain extent, they're not really concerned about what happens in the United States. They're concerned about what's happening in their bailiwick.
Right.
So, you get the full gamut from closely interested to disinterested.
Okay.
We're going to destroy you no matter who's in power.
By the way, it's a real plus to have someone on who will say things like bailiwick every once in a while. That's a
Yes.
increase our vocabulary.
Yeah.
So.
The average IQ on our podcast just went up.
But we did. I'll let Mr. Robinson take the lead, especially with his time there in Kenya, because we did want to talk to you about some of that and some of the work in Africa. Mr. Robinson, what do you have on your mind?
Well, I thought I was really glad that Mr. Nathan, after I ambushed him to see if he would be on the podcast, and I was glad that he wanted to come on because, having just been in Kenya and just getting a little taste of, frankly, trying to help out in the work there in Africa, so much more vast than I realized. And I thought that's maybe one of the things you could add to, you need some help from outside areas to cover Africa and all your areas for the feast. There's just so many sites, more than I realized. How many countries do you have a feast site in Africa?
Well, put it this way, we had 21 feast sites in Africa this year. And now 3 of those were in South Africa, so that knocks you back to a couple. And we had 2 in Kenya, so you got 18 countries covered.
Yes.
And many of those we didn't have a visiting speaker and so on.
So Mr. Muthama there in Nairobi covered that feast site. Then I was the visiting minister there in Kendu Bay. And then one of the other elders from Nairobi was over in Uganda.
That's right.
Then you're using Mr. Reese Ellis with his French-speaking capability to hit French-speaking countries in Africa. I think a lot of Americans would be surprised how much French is actually spoken in
Yeah, there's more French spoken in Africa than English.
Yes.
So, in fact, your largest language spoken in Africa is Swahili, with about 150 million people speaking Swahili. And then you get French, and then thirdly, English. So
that was something new for us when they talked about using Mr. Wilner Pierre to create radio programs in French. It's so easy, especially as an American. You think, oh, English comes. There's England, and there's like French. Oh, they speak French in France and maybe a few other places, and not realizing, no, you create a French language radio program, you have suddenly a vastly multiplied power to impact the work in Africa. That's just not, people tend to forget that it's not just the English speaking peoples that were colonial peoples and have left this lasting input. There's a reason it's kind of ironic to me that we call English the lingua franca, because it's not an English phrase to use to describe it. And so, yeah, if you want to actually really impact the world, French really is one of your leading languages, and Africa really demonstrates that.
Very much so.
I tell people if they want to learn a second language outside of English that I would actually learn French. If you want the one used around the world besides English the most. And I know some people think, well, there's 1 billion people in China and there's a lot of people that speak Spanish and everything. But in terms of like the second language that's spoken the most around the world, it definitely would be French.
Yes. And it was always a language of diplomacy.
Yes. Yes. You and I talked just a little bit earlier about some of the history there in Africa, then some of which I wasn't aware of. So for those who may not know, Kenya, and you said also Uganda, colonies of England at the time, but I didn't realize that at first the British weren't that interested in Kenya.
That's right. So Kenya was purely a protectorate of the British Crown. And the only reason the British were involved in Kenya was to get to Uganda. And of course, the reason for Uganda, the interest in Uganda, was the headwaters of the Nile and protecting the Suez Canal and the passage to India.
Yes.
So the British were concerned about keeping the French out of Uganda, and to get to Uganda, they had to go through Kenya.
That made so much sense as soon as you told me that, because from what I understand, and I don't pretend to be an expert on this, but the Suez Canal was a real game changer, because for England to get to their colonies there in India, they had to sail around the Cape of Good
Cape
Hope?
Horn?
Good Hope.
Yes.
Hope.
Also, a.k.a.
Horn is South America.
Right.
A lot of storms there, apparently. A lot of great white sharks, and any way to shorten that trip and not go through those was
That's right.
The Birkenhead drill, the famous Birkenhead sinking. That's right there off of that, isn't that area?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So interestingly, the Suez Canal was created by a Frenchman, de Lesseps, and then literally taken over by the British.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, because the French also started the first Panama Canal. Didn't quite.
Same
the
man.
Mosquitoes got him.
Oh, the same fella. I actually didn't know that.
Yes, somewhat of a visionary.
So when did Kenya get independence from England?
63, I think, was the exact year.
Okay.
And Jomo Kenyatta was the first president.
Okay.
Or he was first prime minister and then became president as it became a republic.
You told me also, which was just fascinating to me, you told me about a route that people would take as almost, I almost don't even want to call it a vacation, kind of a long journey, but for no purpose other than to see everything.
Well, of course, everyone thinks that cruises are, very much late 20th century, 21st century means of vacations. But at the beginning of the 20th century, Thomas Cook had a cruise package that left Southampton through the Suez Canal to Mombasa in Kenya on the coast, in Indian Ocean. Then the cruises took the Kenya-Uganda railway from Mombasa to Kisumu on the shores of Lake Victoria. It took a boat across Lake Victoria to Entebbe, Kampala. Then they would take a smaller boat down the Nile all the way back to the Mediterranean and sail back to Britain.
When you told me that, the first thing I thought was, that sounds exhausting, and then I thought that also sounds kind of cool. I would take a trip like that, especially, I don't know, it seemed we're pampered by our modern luxuries, but the British traveled in style back then. I'll bet it wasn't too rough.
It wouldn't have been too shabby. They would have done it. These would have been people with considerable spending power who embarked on that, not your mum and pop.
Yeah.
So it would have been done very, very well.
You were telling us earlier that you're about to have a ministerial conference in Africa.
We are, yes, in Nairobi.
That's exciting. How soon is that coming up?
That's coming up in February, beginning of February of 2025. And it gives an interesting perspective of the size of the work in Africa, because we will have 30 elders from various parts of Africa together. And many of them have never met one another.
Wow.
They are so isolated, you might say, geographically. They've never had the opportunity of shaking hands with the other person.
I tell you, for our listeners, just to know, the few ministerial conferences, we used to have them every once in a while at general conference of just all the ministers that could come, especially in the U.S., but then sometimes smaller conferences. And, especially when you're pastoring, and I can only imagine this is magnified in a condition like where they're working is so spread out. It's I'm not gonna say please pity it, but it's a very lonely job. It's not like a coworker you have where you can talk to another guy, Bob, about how things were going today and how was his day. Often you're a lone elder serving in an area, and even just to run ideas off someone or to ask someone's thoughts about your sermon or something, it's like the benefit you get from a good, friendly coworker, but here it's all the more. It's the most important things in the world: counseling and working with people. And for those opportunities, when you can get together with those who are doing the same job you are, serving God's people elsewhere, and to just not necessarily always with us, you have a specific agenda, but even the free time you have together to be able to talk about your circumstances, it's like gold. I mean, it really is. It really is treasure, and I'm excited for the opportunity they're going to have for that.
Oh, we're very excited about it.
Yeah.
Very excited.
When's the last time there's been anything like this there?
We tried to do something like that in 1977 or 78, but that meant bringing 2 men from West Africa to South Africa.
Wow.
And that's all we had outside of South Africa at that point in time.
Really?
Two
Wow.
elders in West Africa.
Wow.
So every 50 years you try to have a ministerial conference.
We will try and do it more frequently.
I hope so.
Hopefully, by the time the next 50 years are around,
Yes.
we will have different forms of ministerial conferences.
Yay, that's right. In an instant, right? In an instant. maybe
That's
we'll arrive.
right.
Well, it was so nice going to Kenya again for a second time, and I can't remember if I mentioned this on our Feast Recap podcast or not. But this time I was able to, because we'd been before and we knew how the experience worked a little better and how some of the cultural things worked, that from the beginning I was very relaxed and able to enjoy the trip more and just observe things. And then one of the things that I was reminded of is, if you live in the United States or Europe or any modern Western civilization nation, you take for granted our ability to travel around. And that's one of the earliest things I was reminded of again, being in Kenya, and not so much Nairobi, but you get out in the rural areas, and Kendu Bay, I would say, qualifies as a fairly rural area. It's like, if you want to get somewhere, your first option is walking. And then if you can hire a motorcycle, and they all seem to have the same motorcycle. I think they're Indian made, aren't they? Indian
or Chinese.
And they have these long seats on them so you can get 3 or 4 people. We started paying attention. I think the most people we ever saw in one was 5, but some of those were smaller kids. There was one time we took Mrs. Abak. She rode with us back down into town from where the feast is held. It's not very far. And she is she in her 80s now? I don't.
Very close to her 80 years.
Here she is hopping on a motorcycle to get back up to the property, and it's all quite amazing. And then from there, there's what we would think of as these big Toyota vans, the kind of little 4-wheel drive looking ones that if you want to maybe get in between the cities. And so I can imagine. My point is, I'm not sure what kind of travel Reese Ellis had to do to get to some of his sites. You hire a driver for us to get around some of our areas, but to get the challenges of having a ministerial conference in Africa, I have to imagine are not insubstantial.
Well, most guys have to fly across the continent to get to where you're going to hold the conference. Now, of course, having it in Nairobi, we have a predominance of elders in East Africa. So those from Burundi, Tanzania, Uganda, and so forth can come by road rather than having to fly. And that helps keep the cost down.
You were also reminding me that Nairobi, just on an international footing, is kind of a home base for a lot of work in Africa. Some UN things are based out of there?
That's right. So the United Nations Environmental Program is headed in or based in Nairobi. Huh. And there are a couple of other United Nations programs there. So Nairobi becomes a big conference center.
We noticed that the hotel we stayed in Nairobi, quite clearly people coming in from around the region visiting, a real mix of people, from Westerners. We saw Chinese or Japanese, not sure. India, South Africa. We even talked to a South African guy for a while, and it was really fascinating.
Yes.
With I did want to follow up on Mr. Pierre and the radio program. I'm not sure how long we've had that going now, but is it at a point where you're seeing any kind of fruit from that? Are you noticing anything, or is it still too early?
It's a bit too early yet.
Okay.
We had one start with it, and it didn't fly. We had some procedural problems with it. Now we're starting using it in Benin, and so by the time the conference comes around, we will see some responses.
Oh, that would be great. And some of our listeners might be surprised, but it is radio. Is that we've tried the work in the U.S. on radio here and there. We've been encouraged, and I remember Mr. Wayne Pyle from way back saying that we just don't get any results from it. Mm-hmm. It's hard to justify the expense. We can use it elsewhere, but radio is still a viable means there.
A very viable means in Africa because people don't have TV, and obviously you can use your cell phone these days, and smartphones are becoming as ubiquitous in Africa as anywhere else.
Yeah.
But radio still has a place in Africa.
I remember when we were there 9 years ago in Kenya that a lot of people had phones, but a lot of them were still more of the flip style. Mm-hmm. This time I noticed there had been quite a transition over to smartphones.
Yes. Yeah, so it's really great because one of the ways we communicate in Africa is with WhatsApp.
That seems to be, I say international, outside of the U.S., it seems like the almost default app. It's really influential, isn't it?
Well, many of the cell phone carriers offer programs, airtime with WhatsApp sort of stitched on, free of charge.
Really?
So it becomes a very cheap way for people to communicate. And the beauty with WhatsApp, of course, is you can send a person a download. They can download it and watch it offline. And they're not using up airtime or data in watching a program.
Right, they're not having to stream it live or something.
Right.
They can just simply download it and they can watch it anytime they want.
That's right. So with most of the elders in Africa, we're probably communicating with them 3 or 4 times a week by WhatsApp, including videos.
Well, that's what I noticed when I got there we were arriving in Kuala Lumpur this year in Malaysia. I wanted to make sure I coordinated with Mr. Moses. We got to the airport and I reached out to him by text because we have all of our phone numbers. And he responded. Then it hit me. Oh, wait, I've heard Mr. Nathan and others talk about WhatsApp being a real big deal. I bet he's on there. And I hadn't used that app since I've downloaded it, I think. And anyway, but I still had it. So I opened it up, did a search, found him. and reached out. He's like, "Oh, you're on WhatsApp. That's great." Next thing I know, I'm hearing from him and Mr. Ronald, his son, Ronald Moses. And I mean, since then I've heard from, I think, all the members there in Kuala Lumpur, because it's the default. They talk about using it for Bible study. I think Bible studies can, that you can, they've got groups assigned for different things in the congregation. Just seems like a great, real service.
Yes.
I had to cave this time and get WhatsApp. I steer clear of the Meta-owned stuff. But
it is Facebook owned, right? Isn't it?
But it made life so much easier. And the thing it does that to me was, if you go international and you get an international SIM, well, they don't care what your phone number is back in America. And so, if you communicate with people back home, it's through means other than your phone number, because as far as your phone's concerned, you have a different international phone number. But with WhatsApp, your anchor is your home phone number, and so you can do. And then, so here's an example. I texted Mr. Nathan. I hope he thinks this is funny. I get to Kendu Bay, and they start showing me the schedule on how I'm speaking 47 times, and I thought, well, I haven't prepared that many sermons. And as I text Mr. Nathan about that, and his reply was essentially, "I think you can handle it."
Which he did.
Which I did.
Yes,
I had a backup sermon that it was for other purposes, but I just tried to tailor it, make it work, and everything was fine.
Yeah. Now, television also has a place. Charlotte has just been able to get an availability on ETV in South Africa.
That's right.
And that is going like hotcakes. We're getting a couple of hundred new responses a week to that. And that really is stimulating to see.
Yeah, that is exciting. Mr. Dexter Wakefield was talking about that this past week.
That's correct.
That it's wow, what a real potential! What real potential that has ETV over there.
I have just one other question, and then please, if there's anything else you want to add that you've observed that we may not know, but I've noticed when I've traveled internationally in the past that one of the challenges in international areas can be bringing young men along and getting, leaders. There's always a need for good leaders. And what are some of the challenges for you to and I know it's not just you through a team of the elders, as you mentioned, the 30 elders in Africa, but identifying young men and getting them in a training program of sorts and getting them giving sermonettes, just like we would do in the States, but in the international areas, are there any particular challenges? I was struck in Nairobi. I mentioned it on the podcast that we did for the feast. A couple of great guys there in Nairobi, really doing a fantastic job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, fortunately, the Eternal provides. That's a starting point. But technology has also developed to the point where we can connect people by Zoom or WebEx or one of these video platforms. And so we have been running spokesmen's clubs from Europe and from Cape Town, which have incorporated men in various African countries. Mm-hmm. So you got somebody in the Democratic Republic of Congo giving a speech in French to his colleagues in Charleroi in Belgium.
Wow.
Or someone in Senegal, or someone in Malawi connecting with the guys in Cape Town. So the one in Cape Town is English, the one in Charleroi is in French. So, we're able to use these means to get people involved in Spokesman's Club, and that's a really good foundational tool for helping young people come along. Now we're, of course, expanding that, and we're starting up an AL, Advanced Leadership Training Program, and that will incorporate people from French and English countries together, all the way from the Netherlands all the way down to Cape Town.
So what you're saying is if you're in America and you think club's tough, you should try a multilingual club.
That's right.
That is exciting because it's very easy to just be negative about so many of these innovations we make. And I do think in general it's our phones are the way we interact now online. Actually, I'll try to show you a quick one of these animated graphs that shows throughout the years, it goes back to the 70s, how people interacted with each other, where they spent most of their time, and it has friends, family, church. And then eventually, as it's going through, it has online at the bottom at 0%. Because what happens is as it grows to past others, it'll rearrange the
That's
terms.
right.
And online is at 0 until you get to, I think it's around the 80s, and a tiny percentage starts growing and it starts to pass things. And then you get to the 2000s, it just shoots to the top. And people are on online more than anything else. And then it stays on top while in perspective, everything else just starts to shrink to almost nothing as it dominates. So there are these things that kind of take over our lives. And yet Mr. Armstrong used to often say that a lot of things aren't inherently good or bad. It's how you use them. And everything I keep hearing out of what you guys are doing in Europe and in Africa is you're taking these tools, and sure, they could be misused, but no, we're going to do our best to plug brethren in together and to try to use them for profitable purposes.
Well, to give you an example, when I first went to West Africa in the 1970s, 1977, if I wanted to call someone outside of, say, Ghana, I had to go down to the International Telephone Exchange and book a call. And because the cables and the lines were so limited, me as a peon would have to turn up at about 3 o'clock in the morning to make a telephone call to someone in England. So that was the level of communication you had. Now, of course, with the advent of cell phone, most of these nations have never had landlines. They have bypassed the landline era altogether. And landlines have been, you might say, confined to a very small elite government officials in the capital cities, and that's basically it. Nowadays, everyone, even in the rural areas, can have a telephone.
That's fascinating to me. I never thought about that. I'd heard about the very quick growth of cell phones in some of these far-flung areas. I never thought about it for them. I mean, we're taking landlines for granted. I was a teenager. I spent a lot of time. Our younger audience wouldn't understand it, but yeah, with a wire between my head and the wall where I'm talking to my friends on the phone.
It sounds so crude now.
It does now, right? Like you're a caveman. But they didn't even have that. And so with the advent of mass wireless communication, suddenly a whole world of communication was opened up to them. I never thought about that before.
I had a wonderful experience one time in a town in Kenya. I was trying to get something printed, and there's a whole bunch of computer shops up and down the main street of this little town. And I went into one, and they had some laptops there, and a very pretty young lady, a Kenyan girl, was helping this old guy who was obviously a farmer. He spent his whole life picking away with a hoe and weeding his corn, etc., etc. And so, rough textures and everything to him. And she obviously connected him to somebody online on this computer. And to see the look of amazement spread over this man's face as this image formed in front of him was just
wow.
It's just unbelievable, because he'd never seen anything like it in his life. Now he was connected to maybe his son or his daughter of the United States.
Right. So easy to take for granted here.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for being with us. If you just, we're not trying to surprise you with such an open question, but before we close down with our audience here, it's generally teens and young adults as well as families. There's families listening, but I know especially after the fantastic Behind the Work video a couple of years ago that really just helped open the world in the eyes of so many to see what a beautiful and rich, not only work we have going on in Africa, but their own brethren, their own brothers and sisters in Christ there in that continent. Is there anything you'd want to, if you want to advise anyone listening about what to pray for, in the area, in the work there, and for the people there, what are some things you would ask us to do?
Well, two things. It would be great to develop some programs for young people. We have a summer camp program in Kenya, and literally I allowed them to create it themselves, and they sort of dug around the edges to find out what the church does in terms of it. But a wonderful opportunity for young people to be involved in helping other young people. So Mr. McNear has organized this teaching program in Thailand, there are opportunities for replicating that in, say, parts of Kenya.
Oh, that'd be wonderful.
Or maybe skill sets, developing of skill sets, etc. So there's one area. The other areas, we face some real problems in Kenya that people need to, not just Kenya, excuse me, in Africa, that people need to pray about, because it seems as though governments increasingly are trying to clamp down on churches.
Okay, could you elaborate on that?
Yes.
Because I did hear that the other week.
Right. Now, Mr. Hernandez made a point in the Behind the Work film this year about in 1990, 93% of people in South America were Catholic. Today it's 56%. Now that attrition has not come because the Catholic Church has stopped operating. It's because of the rise of the evangelical, Pentecostal house churches, etc., eating away at the fabric of the society. And of course, it's much easier for the governments in some of these countries to deal with one body like the Catholic Church, where they can control the politics of the church and so forth. Whereas when you've got a myriad of churches, how do you control them?
Right.
How do you control the thinking of people? And governments are starting to react against that and trying to bring a certain amount of homogeneity back to the scene.
That actually makes a lot of sense.
And of course, in the late 19th century, 20th century, Catholic Church, the Church of England, the Methodist Church, SDAs, provided a lot of infrastructure for a country in terms of hospitals, schools, etc. And governments say, you're going to be a church, you're going to provide infrastructure. You're going to provide a school, you're going to provide a clinic, you've got to. So in other words, we're being called upon to do things which we don't see as being essential to the preaching of the gospel.
But they're beginning to require that. If you want to be a church recognized in this nation, you're going to do all these things.
That's right.
Wow. That is a burden.
Yeah.
Yes. So certainly we would appreciate everyone's prayers for God's guidance and leadership in terms of that.
Well, thank you for that. So, hey, everyone listening, now you know. That's it. Thank you so much. And we'll certainly be praying for the conference as well. We're very excited about that. Thank you for being on, Mr. Nathan. We really appreciate it.
Our pleasure. So we can say Kwaheri.
Smith and Robinson.